Effects of Social Sanctions on Drug Addicts by Lin-Z. What role does society play in the entry to the world of deviance as a drug addict or alcoholic compared to their genetic predisposition? And do drug addicts fail to attain recovery because of the sanctions placed on them due to their entry into the addict world? So, why was this chosen, right? When a person grows up in poverty with no higher educational prospects or career options, dealing drugs may seem to be the only way out. So, this individual may dream of having better things than their own parents. When the neighborhood is rampant with drug dealers with nice things, the prospects seem justified to fall into the same occupation, despite the obvious criminal risks. After all of this, the individual can easily slip into addiction with drugs being so accessible. So, this is because society plays a part in an addiction, and also Marshall Clinard and Robert Muir, they also point out about the enemy theory, which advances the core idea that elements in society's structure promote deviance by making deviant behavior a viable adaptation to living in society. So the example I just explained. So there's more to the life of an addict and how they arrived in that place of addiction. So why is this important? So society plays a part in the role of an addict and their ability to seek recovery. When an addict decides to change their life out of addiction, they are faced with the threat of being ostracized from the social community because of the stigma attached to their former addicted life. Labeling theory sheds light on the dangers that these stigmas may have on the group of alcoholics or addicts. So, a person addicted to opioids may avoid seeking care out of fear of being labeled junkie, and a recovering alcoholic may be marginalized for not partaking when out with friends, affecting their success in recovery. Addiction and alcoholism are not a choice, it is a brain disease. So, sanctions in society treat addiction as deviant behavior, further secluding drug users, even though it is a brain disease. There is a paradox in recovery where a sense of belonging needs to be accumulated to prevent future relapse. The potential contributions of this study is to reduce stigma so that recovery can be successful. So society plays a part in addiction by creating stigmas that keep addicts from getting help. Society's stigmas push addicts further into the drug world by creating barriers for support. And the paradox lays in the need for social support for addicts to seek and retain recovery. The picture here shows that never-ending paradox, the public stigma, discrimination, and prejudice, damage to self-esteem, self-stigma, shame, self-doubt, reduced rates of recovery, dropout of treatment, and they use substances to avoid or suppress negative effects. So their genetic predisposition makes it likely to have adverse reactions to drugs or alcohol in the form of addiction, but this study that follows can contribute to evidence for the false stigma society holds for addicts and alcoholics being deviants. These individuals face more barriers from society than their genetic predisposition alone. Many of their backgrounds include trauma, food insecurity, and poverty. Literature review. So society plays a part in the role of an addict and their ability to seek recovery. And when an addict decides to change their life out of addiction, they're faced with the threat of being ostracized from the social community because of the stigma attached to their former addicted life. According to James Ragsdale and Marta Elliott, this public stigma around addiction fuels the opioid epidemic in the US by deterring seeking help, lowering quality of medical treatment, and reducing support for public health policy. Isolating opioid users further internalizes harmful stereotypes like addict or junkie. And so Ragsdale and Elliott, they created a study to examine whether attributing opioid addiction to economic stressors associated with job loss reduces stigma and increases desire to help a hypothetical man that is addicted to opioids. So the cause of addiction was assessed using 3 7-point scales ranging from 1, very unlikely, to 7, very likely. The items measured whether the addiction was because of biology or bad character. The results showed that respondents were less likely to blame the addiction on bad character when the user was Black. However, they blamed bad character when the user was a janitor versus computer scientist, and when the user bought drugs on the street versus a doctor. The authors originally hypothesized that people would judge a janitor and obtaining drugs on the street more harshly, and the results align with this. The results show that stigma for addicts take their forms in stereotypes through labeling, prejudice, discrimination, and status loss. So Samantha Rundle furthers this discussion by stating that a review at the World Health Organization concluded that addictive disorders were the most stigmatized health conditions. The authors used survey data collected from Canada, the US, and Australia. Participants showed varying stigma toward the character and beliefs related to disease, moral, psychological, and sociological in nature. The results were similar to Ragsdale and Elliott, and the fact that alcohol and other drug-related disorders are more stigmatized than others. And here, the picture on the right is the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, talking about how substance use disorders affect all walks of life and how the stigma affects the addict's recovery. Addiction and alcoholism are not a choice, it is a brain disease. So sanctions in society treat addiction as deviant behavior, further secluding drug users. However, there is a paradox in recovery where a sense of belonging needs to be accumulated to prevent future relapse. So here, Samantha Lukács et al. Created a study and hypothesized that greater social support would be associated with reduced substance use and greater readiness to change. So both variables are consistent with the literature and variables for successful recovery. And the study combined data from 2 control trials that evaluated the effect of continuing care for people with substance use. So each group began at the start of the intensive outpatient treatment and followed up at the 24-month period using a 20-item Likert scale to measure social support. And the results found that the more social support received, the higher their readiness to change and reduced social support. The study reveals that social support significantly plays a part in successful recovery. Reducing stigma through change and defining addiction as criminal. So Patrick Corrigan and authors created an extensive review of the stigma literature about addiction compared to mental health. The hypothesis was that the change in the view of addiction as criminal would help diminish the impact of public and self-stigma. And the authors found that erasing stigma included 3 distinct categories listed here: services, rights, and self-worth. Because of attempts at avoiding being labeled as an addict, people avoid evidence-based treatment. Public stigma hinders users to achieve personal goals at work, independently living, and health. Finally, due to self-stigma, addicts are shamed on the pursuit of their personal goals. The results were that in order to remedy these issues, providers and others need to show confidence in the benefits of treatment, advocates need to demand social justice, and others with lived experience need to be a part of the recovery process to replace shame with self-worth. Philip Borges and other authors conducted an ethnography among street-level heroin injectors in San Francisco. So the ethnography is in risky behaviors. And it recorded instances of 75 to 100 addicts through photographs and video. The authors found that the addicts engage in risky behaviors because of their need to stay medicated on their drug of choice. These risky behaviors include robbing for drug money to sharing needles that can be contaminated with HIV. The authors found that participants admitted to falsifying answers on questionnaires regarding risky behavior for outreach workers. One man, Hogan, admitted to lying because it was what he, quote, sounded good at the time, even though he shared needles several times a day. This was to stay in denial about their risky behaviors to maintain some kind of false dignity. The need for denial to maintain a persona is tied with the social coercion around substance abuse. Laws against public intoxication or sleeping in public pushes addicts to inject drugs in unhealthy places. The same laws also prevent addicts from maintaining stable income generating strategies. The methodology for my project was qualitative data that was gathered through in-depth sociological interviews using an interpretive approach. So this approach does not follow a testing model to make generalizable a general hypothesis and instead uses an interpretive framework to understand social worlds. This was to gather information from first-person perspective to further understand the addict or alcoholic's world. This provides a wealth of knowledge of experiences the social world deems stigmatized and active addiction. Thus, each participant's name was kept confidential due to the nature of the questions. Qualitative data was chosen to seek out why and how stigma personally affects the entrance to recovery and the process of recovery itself. So prior literature shows success in gathering qualitative data through ethnography with this marginalized group and gain perspective on why drug users continue to engage in risky behaviors, which led to legislation on distribution of clean needles to the population. So this insight into the effects of stigmatization can provide further evidence as to why this needs to change. Due to limited time for data collection and availability of a generalizable sample size, this chosen research method worked best for this topic, and the interview questions allowed for variability in responses. So interviews were gathered through members of Alcoholics Anonymous currently attending in the Riverside, California area. Alcoholics Anonymous is a 12-step program that alcoholics or addicts attend to seek recovery. 5 participants were chosen, ranging in what the world deemed as the worst of addiction, like becoming homeless, to alcoholics who kept their jobs during their alcoholism and had 3 to 10 years of sobriety to the current date. This was based on prior literature, which shows that the population stigmatizes those more with drugs obtained illegally compared to prescribed or legal. In light of this, 2 out of the 5 participants had become homeless and their drug of choice was obtained illegally over the course of their addiction. Stories of their lives were known prior to choosing each participant because of my own attendance at AA meetings within the last 5 years of my own recovery. So the data collection process was that each participant was reached through phone calls. First, a text was sent out explaining the process of the interview and the use of the responses in a research paper specifically. Respondents were notified of the confidentiality requirements by informing them that they would remain anonymous. 4 questions were selected for interviews, 2 regarding the process of entering recovery, and 2 related to the importance of social support through recovery. The first question was, do you think that alcoholism leads you to deviant behavior because of society's prejudice against your alcoholism, or was it your genetic predisposition? And the second question was, has society's view of alcoholism affected your recovery? And so both of these questions allowed participants to dive into the question regarding the role the world plays in their entry into the world of deviance compared to their genetic predisposition. After these questions were asked, the respondents were told to think back to the end of their addiction when they were trying to enter into the normal social world. This is when the most stigma is likely to be experienced for alcoholics or addicts. Last two questions were, has society's view affected your recovery? And how has social support changed your life in recovery? These questions were in light of prior literature regarding social support as a necessary part of successful recovery from addiction. Responses were typed into Microsoft Word in real time during the interview process, and once the questions were answered, the responses were reiterated to make sure it was recorded properly. And at the conclusion of the interview, it was asked if there was anything else they would like to add to the discussion. So this was the data analysis for the first question. Has society shown prejudice towards your alcoholism or addiction, and in what way? So all 5 answered yes to the question and gave examples on how it affected them in a negative way. And this provides more evidence to the prior literature by Patrick Corrigan, which created the extensive review of the stigma literature about addiction compared to mental health in the previous slide. This also sheds light to the effects of labeling theory mentioned in slide 3. Every participant gave examples of being marginalized by being placed into a deviant category, and one participant learned to work around the stigma by saying they have a problem with alcohol instead of heroin. The next question that I asked was, has society's view affected your recovery? So 4 out of the 5 participants mentioned having to adjust to society's view of their conditions. It is either being selective who they share their past with or being aware about events with drinking. One person mentioned that they are now a safe space for others that are struggling. And the question, how has social support changed your life in recovery? It was unanimous amongst participants about the ultimate necessity that social support has been in their recovery. So, and here it says, one said, I think it's like everything. It makes me feel not alone and that I feel supported with multiple people that understand. Initially, I thought that the stigma of society would be credited more instead of genetic predisposition. However, the study showed different results. Social support is necessary for successful recovery so that addicts have encouragement from others that have been through the same process. Clinard and Meyer mentioned that Anami theory advances the core idea that elements in society structure promote deviance by making deviant behavior a viable adaptation to living in the society. So, social support was found to be essential in every participant's recovery, aligning with the literature. However, genetic predisposition was mentioned as the biggest reason for deviance. Further research regarding genetic predisposition to alcoholism and deviant behavior would be helpful for further analysis. Every participant mentioned shame in their recovery experience, aligning with prior literature, where stigma can cause shame and deter individuals from seeking help. More research on anomy theory, possibly following twins with environment differences and seeing to see it is genetic predisposition or stigma. John 7:24 says, "Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly." These findings show the importance of not judging, like the scriptures bring out here, and we should not judge our neighbor because it could have dire consequences for them in their life.